Well, good morning, everyone. This is George Spees for the Pennsylvania Office of Open Records. Welcome to this morning's webinar where we're going to be discussing basics of the Sunshine Act, otherwise known as Pennsylvania's Open Meetings Law. Let's go over a couple preliminaries before we jump into the actual presentation. First is that this is essentially a PowerPoint presentation with me talking in the background. All of our PowerPoints, including this one, are available on our website if you'd like to access them. You go over to the training tab, scroll down, and you'll find links to those PowerPoints. It's possible that you have a friend or colleague who couldn't join us this morning, maybe just for your own future reference, or perhaps you're conducting some sort of localized training and you find these resources useful to you. Feel free to download them as needed. This session is also being recorded, pardon me, and those recordings are available. If you would like a copy of that, send an email to our account. The website address is on the screen right now, and the administrative staff will arrange for you to receive a link that will give you access to the recording. Also, I think some of the recordings are posted about a couple days after, also on the training tab of the website. Now, you can ask questions during this presentation by typing them in the chat feature, and I will do my best to answer them live for the good of the order here. However, I have two conditions that I'd like you to ascribe to. First is that we're here talking about the Sunshine Act, so let's stay on topic. And second is that the shorter and more succinct you can keep your questions, the better. What happens is occasionally some folks will type in, several paragraphs or a couple pages, it seems. And it's just very awkward for me to sit here, read through that while everyone else is waiting patiently. I will do my best to answer your questions as we're going through, but if it appears that the questions relate to something specific to your situation or are unusually complex, we'll do one of two things. We'll wait until the end of the presentation and I'll come back to it and try to answer it for the benefit of everybody who can hang around. Or we'll take the conversation offline. The contact information for the office is on the screen right now. You can call in or send us an email with your questions, and we will do our best to get you headed in the right direction. Your inquiries will first come to the administrative staff, who are fairly well versed in all of this. And if it appears you've stumped the panel, your inquiry will get escalated to one of the senior staff, and they will be back to you as quickly as possible. And again, we'll do our best to get you headed in the right direction. We can't provide legal advice, just so you're aware of that. If you've got some situation that you think you're looking for an attorney to help you out, our attorneys won't be able to do that for you. You'll need to consult one on your own. Okay, question has popped up right away. How is the Sunshine Act different from the Right to Know law? Sunshine Act, open meetings. Right to Know law, access to public records. That's the difference. We also do a webinar on the Right to Know law. This is not it. Okay, so all those preliminaries out of the way, let's jump into the presentation. First off, Ann, I think it's important to talk about why the Sunshine Act is important. And like I said, it's the open meetings law for Pennsylvania. But I like to go right to the law itself and kind of read from the preamble to it. Now, bear with me here. The right of the public to be present at all meetings of agencies and to witness the deliberation and decision-making of agencies. It's vital to the democratic process. Secrecy in that process, in public affairs, undermines the faith of the public in government and the public's effectiveness in fulfilling its role in a democratic society. Okay, a very altruistic statement that I have more or less encapsulated there. But I think it goes right to the heart of the matter. In Pennsylvania, like many states, in the United States, but in Pennsylvania in particular, we as citizens, as residents, have the right to participate, to witness how our government makes the decisions that will affect us. And it's the Sunshine Law that guarantees that. You're thinking, okay, well, you know, that's no big deal. I mean, that's just part of democracy. But I'll just say this. In the last couple of years, I've had the opportunity to travel to different countries. And I'm thinking 2.5 years ago, okay, I went to Guatemala. And it was quite a trip. But we landed in Guatemala City, and I was on a bus driving through the city, and we were passed by a pickup truck with, I'm assuming, men dressed in black, head to toe. Their heads were covered, faces were covered, carrying machine guns in the back of this pickup. Quite honestly, I didn't know if they were good guys or bad guys. I just saw machine guns, okay? And it just seemed like a normal occurrence as far as everyone standing around was concerned. Now, I'm guessing that in Guatemala, you don't have the opportunity to stand in front of your public officials, point your finger at them, and tell them what you think is wrong with what they're about to do, okay? Only in Pennsylvania do we have the Sunshine Act, which affords us. And so I attach great importance to this. Okay, now I'm going to get down off my soapbox and tell you about what I consider to be the 3 main points that we're going to cover here today concerning the open meetings law. People will call in periodically with questions, and they can be, you know, ordinary citizens, or they can be on the other side of the equation, working for agencies. And when I use that term agency, it's generic. We're talking about any cabinet level department at the state level, boards, commissions, authorities at the local level, cities, boroughs, townships, school districts, and the like. Okay, so they'll call in and they'll ask, you know, how should we do this? Or maybe someone will be concerned, and it's like, that's against the law, isn't it? You know, that's a common statement. So we look at these 3 primary factors as an initial diagnosis as to whether or not the actions have been consistent with the act or will be consistent with the act. First, has the agency provided advance notice and instructions on how to attend? Okay, now, as a physical meeting, you would need to provide the physical address. You know, what meeting room, what's the address that this meeting is going to be at? And then if there is an online component, whether it be Zoom or Skype or, well, not Skype, but Teams or some other online platform, how do you log in? How do you get into this meeting? Okay, then, is there an opportunity to observe the deliberations? Okay, now that says more than what you think. Deliberations has a specific definition, and we're going to talk about those definitions. But as a member, as a citizen, as a resident of a jurisdiction, I have a right to sit in and observe the discussion that leads to the decisions that my public officials are going to make. Okay, and whenever someone is trying to understand a law and how it works, oftentimes the language might be confusing. It may appear that there are contradictions. I advise them to go to the definition section. And a lot of times that will add clarity to whatever you're confused about. And the Sunshine Act is no exception. And you'll find a definition for the term deliberation, which in this instance is any discussion that could lead to a decision. I didn't say will lead to a decision, I said could lead. So that kind of opens things up as far as what deliberation actually is. And then the third leg of this 3-legged stool is that we have the right to comment on any decisions prior to those decisions actually being made. And again, the term decision has a specific definition. And essentially, it's a vote. It's the decision by the public officials to proceed with a particular course of action. So prior to that decision, we have the right to stand up in front of our public officials and tell them what we think. Okay, that's part of democracy, and that's part of what Pennsylvania's Sunshine Act affords us as residents and taxpayers. Now, let's move forward, get a little more specific here, and talk about who is covered by the Sunshine Act. And I'm going to go right to the act itself and kind of paraphrase some of the language. First, it applies to any state or local government body and all committees. Okay, that term committees is italicized because oftentimes that's a sticking point. You know, is the committee covered by the Sunshine Act? Well, if you look at the definition, it appears pretty black and white. But then it goes further into explaining the role of that committee. Okay, and here we're talking about the government body and committees that perform an essential government function. Okay, that admittedly is a very subjective phrase. What is an essential government function? Well, let me give you an example that I'd like to use here. Let's say that our local township, the local girls softball team, has won the state championship. Now, the supervisors have decided we need to celebrate this accomplishment. So we're going to appoint an ad hoc committee that's going to oversee a parade and a gathering at the township park where we recognize, you know, the accomplishment of our girls softball team. Now, I would argue that as notable as their efforts are, unfortunately, it would not be considered an essential government function to have a parade and celebration for the girls softball team. Okay, you know, and if you knew the township I lived in, I'd be very careful about repeating that. But the point is that it's not essential to the running of government functions that we have a parade. Okay, thus, I would probably argue that any gathering of that ad hoc committee would not be covered by the Sunshine Act because it's not, they're not working on what would otherwise be an essential government function. Now, that committee also would be empowered to exercise authority to take official action. Again, official action has a specific definition. And within the language of that definition, I just want to clarify that the term making recommendations falls within that definition. So that if you have a committee tasked with working on an essential government function, and the result of their gathering is to make a recommendation back to the elected board, then the gathering of that committee would be under the jurisdiction of the Sunshine Act. Okay? Now, if I were to change this up a little bit, let's say the gathering is of a standing committee appointed by the elected officials to annually review all public ordinances to ensure that the language is clear and up to date. The ordinances don't conflict with any other ordinances or state or federal law. That in fact, there's still a need for such an ordinance, that conditions haven't changed or whatever, and then report back to the elected officials on any proposed changes to the ordinance is. That, I think we could argue, is an essential government function. And the gatherings of that committee would be considered to be covered by the Sunshine Act, and it should be opened up to public scrutiny. Okay, now, since we're talking about committees at this point, I want to point out who serves on the committees. Now, there is a common misunderstanding that there must be a quorum of elected officials on the committee in order to be covered by the Sunshine Act. That is not accurate. You can have a committee that meets all of these conditions without a single elected official on it, and it would still be subject to the Sunshine Act, okay? We're looking at the language of the law, not the assumptions that people make about the law. So, state or local government body and its committees, are they performing an essential government function? Are they exercising authority to take official action? And bear in mind that making recommendations is considered an official action. Okay, a couple questions have popped up here. If the committee was permitted to make recommendations of spending government money on the parade, would that change things? Potentially. I think we'd have to look at some specific factors there, and I'm going to say, you know, unfortunately, Walt, it depends. I think we'd have to look at it on a case-by-case basis. If the money were already budgeted for a parade and celebration, then I would say the decision has already been made as part of the approval of the budget. Now, if you're just spending monies that have already been allocated, I would say probably not, okay? Because that's an administrative action and it's just considered, you know, part of government doing its normal business. The big decisions have already been made. If not, if you're somehow raising new funds, then I think that does change things. But, you know, it's going to depend on the specifics. Okay, another question, making recommendations, official action. Is that set forth in the statute or is that in a court opinion? That's actually in the definition of official action within the Sunshine Act itself. Okay, it's not a court citation, it's in the law. Okay, let's move on to a little more specific as to who is covered. And we want to talk about committees. Now, we were just asked about a court opinion. Okay, this further analysis as to whether your committee is covered is based on a court decision. Okay, and the citation would be Ristow versus Casey, Ristow being the last name of someone. And the Commonwealth Court, I believe, ruled on this and extrapolated from the discussion. Here are some additional points that we use as guidance here at the Office of Open Records. And bear in mind, the Office of Open Records has no enforcement authority when it comes to the Sunshine Act. Our role is simply to provide guidance and training when it comes to the act. And we'll talk about enforcement when we get to the end of the presentation. Okay, but here are some questions that need to be answered. Does the committee have decision-making authority? Ristow versus Casey. Okay, does the decision have, does the committee have decision-making authority? And you're thinking, well, why wouldn't a committee, too fast. Okay, Ristow, R-I-S-T-A-U. There you go. And it's Casey, as in Governor Robert Casey. Okay, moving on. You're thinking, oh, well, why wouldn't a committee have decision-making authority? Well, you know, the reality is that occasionally the best way to make a sensitive issue go away is to assign it to a committee. All right, so the role of the committee might be simply gather information, come back to us, educate us on the situation. We'll make our own recommendations, okay? We don't want to know what you think. We just want you, put this committee of experts together to come back to us with information, and we'll make a decision based on the information, okay? No decision-making authority. Okay, and then are the members appointed by the board, and are they authorized to act on its behalf? Again, that seems like a no-brainer, but you can find committees, standing committees, where there's no nexus between the makeup of that committee and the elected board. Public libraries are an interesting animal in Pennsylvania because there is a public library law that now governs how any new public library or newer public library boards are to be made up and what what decision-making authority that they have. But there are some public library boards that predate the actual elected officials and the makeup of that jurisdiction. So they're all over the map in Pennsylvania as to how they're made up. But it's not unusual to find a public library board that is self-perpetuating, meaning that if someone were to go off the board, I can't volunteer anymore, I'm moving out of the area, so I have to resign. Rather than the elected officials filling the vacancy, the arrangement is that the remaining library board members go out and beat the bushes for another volunteer board member. Okay, so they're not appointed by the board, and given how the public library might be organized, there's no real relationship between the public library and the local jurisdiction. So any decisions that the library board makes are independent of the elected boards. So you would not really consider them a subunit of the elected board. Thus, their meetings would not be subject to the Sunshine Act. Now, interestingly, in researching this issue over the years, the majority of public libraries voluntarily adhere to the Sunshine Act. They open their board meetings, which, more power to them. I think it's great. But, as public libraries evolve, we're seeing more and more what I'll call a greater nexus between the elected boards, the elected bodies that they serve, and the public libraries because of funding and getting grants and everything. So gradually they're moving into that universe. But, it's an interesting example that applies to this particular condition. Are the recommendations pursuant to statute, ordinance, regulatory authority, or a judge's decision where the end result is the enactment of laws, policies, or regulations? Okay, that one I think really cuts to the chase here and is critical when considering the role of the committee. Is what they're doing going to result in changing or enacting a law, policy, or regulation? Okay, the girls softball team, the answer would be no. Okay, we're celebrating this wonderful accomplishment that they have done. But are we going to change a law as a result? And is it pursuant to statute? Is there a law someplace that says if the girls softball team wins the state championship, you got to have a parade? No, there isn't. Not that I'm aware of. Okay, so that one I think is really illustrative of how you would make the decision. Is the committee and its gatherings covered by the Sunshine Act? Now, all this being said, you're still not sure, okay? Because here I am speaking Greek to you and you have no idea, whether given the conditions that we're facing here, we should open up these meetings. Well, our position here at the Office of Open Records is lean towards transparency. I say that for two reasons. First, we're the Office of Open Records. We're the government's, Pennsylvania's, basically transparency office. Okay, so of course we're going to say that. But The other reason is more pragmatic, and it has to do with how much work do you want to put into this as a result of whether you open your meeting or not. If you open your meeting, it might be inconvenient. Okay, you've got to advertise, you've got to find a room big enough to hold all the people, you've got to give them the opportunity to comment, so forth. Boy, it'd be a lot easier if we wouldn't have to go through that. What a pain. All right. But what's the alternative? Let's say you have a meeting and you don't open it, and then someone finds out and they end up filing a complaint. So now you're faced with standing up in front of a judge, and you have to pass what I call the straight face test. Can you stand before a judge in a court of law and explain with a straight face why you didn't open your meeting to public participation? And if the judge disagrees with you, things could go south really fast. So if in doubt, if I were in your shoes, I would open up my meeting simply because it's the path of least resistance. But that's up to you, okay? It's your call, and you're rolling the dice as to whether or not someone might file a complaint and you would find yourself in court, okay? Let's move on. One of the first questions we have to ask is it a meeting, okay? And again, definitions become critical here. First offhand, is there a quorum present? Because under most codes, the borough code, township code, the municipal code, and the like, in order for official action to take place, there needs to be a quorum present. Okay, now, a distinction here. Under the borough code and under the first class township code, the quorum must be, and this would be the quorum of elected officials in most cases, the quorum must be physically present. Under the township code and school code and so forth, you don't have to have the quorum physically present. Folks can call in, or they can use an online platform to be part of the meeting. Now, if that's the case, if someone is calling in, it has to be direct conversation, first person, whether it be like a conference call or that online platform. Meaning you can't have someone sitting in the physical meeting with a cell phone up to their ear, relaying back and forth. The person calling in has to hear everybody at the meeting, and everybody at the meeting has to hear the person calling in. Question follow. Can a committee discuss the items at a meeting if a quorum does not exist, so long as no votes are taken? Well, probably not. Okay, and the reason being, you're deliberating. Okay, now you can have discussion. This is, Scott, this is a really gray area. Okay, by rights, it doesn't meet the definition of a meeting because you don't have a quorum present. Okay, but if you're still talking about the business of the agency, then that's deliberation. And by rights, you're not supposed to do that under the Sunshine Act. Unfortunately, we don't have any case law to support that. Okay, so what I'm saying here, take with a grain of salt. And we're going to talk about gatherings here in a little bit. Okay, as a matter of fact, it's the next point. Okay, so we're answering the first question. Is there a quorum? Meaning, could you take a vote given the number of people that you have present? And I might as well cover this while we're at it. The question has come up, well, can we have online meetings where there's no physical presence whatsoever? My answer to that is no. And it's based on my experience in participating in testifying at legislative hearings where the question came up about online meetings, and the legislators present made it quite clear that they believe there should be a physical presence where citizens can look their elected officials in the eye and have face-to-face discussions with them. So our position is that you can have what we call a blended meeting, where there's a physical presence, a conference room or whatever, where the public can be, with elected officials present as well. And then you can also have an online component as part of that physical meeting, but you cannot have an exclusively online meeting per the language in the Sunshine Act. And there is language in the Sunshine Act that also leads me to support that as well. But again, that's not a legal interpretation. That's simply my opinion based on what the Act says and my discussions, or our discussions here at the office with legislators. Is there a link to the legislative discussions? Possibly, but it goes back a couple years, and I think you'd have to, get into the legislature's website and see if you could find that link. Okay, next question needs to be answered. Is there deliberation? And remember what I said deliberation is. It's any discussion that could lead to a decision. Now, the question has come up periodically. Someone will call in and say, hey, I saw a couple of our township supervisors down at the restaurant the other morning having breakfast. Isn't that illegal? Well, no, it's not. It depends on what they're talking about. If they're just talking about the weather, if they're talking about their families, not a problem, okay? They can do that. But if they are talking about the business of, their jurisdiction, the borough, the township, whatever, then that could constitute deliberation. And remember, deliberation is discussion that could lead to a decision, not will lead to a decision. So that you need to be careful about what you're talking. There's nothing wrong with everyone getting together, okay? It's not illegal, but they just need to be careful about the conversation, what it is they're talking about. Okay, then is there decision making? Decision making is usually a vote of some form, where they are resolving to do something as a result of their deliberation. And then finally, I want to just put it out there to be wary of email meetings. A lot of times, especially at the beginning of a term, you've got new people coming in and being seated as public officials. Some of them might be from a business background, and their experiences, well, this is something we can just take care of with emails, so let's just do this. It's more efficient, it's quicker, et cetera, et cetera. Unfortunately, you may be violating the Sunshine Act because those emails, that discussion, is not taking place in the public eye as the Sunshine Act requires. Now, I need to distinguish between policy level decisions and administrative level decisions, because policy level decisions need to adhere to the Sunshine Act. Administrative level decisions do not. And an example I'll use is the budget and paving, okay? As part of the annual budget, we decided to allocate $2 million for some paving to take place in the borough. All right, that was all done above board in front of the public, et cetera, et cetera. We now have an approved budget with that particular line item in it. Okay, the decision has been made. However, now we need to decide where we're going to pave. Well, we've got these two blocks on Elm Street. We've got this particular bumpy piece of road or bumpy piece of street over on Main. It'd be nice if we could do this intersection. Okay, so this is where we're going to pave. All right, that is more administrative in nature, where we're going to pave. The actual decision to allocate the monies and have the paving projects themselves, that was policy. So you can see the distinction. Okay, now sometimes it's subjective, it's hard, it's a little gray. Again, I would recommend erring on the side of transparency. But if it's clearly administrative in nature, where the big decision has already been made as part of a public meeting, then you will probably be okay having that discussion outside of the public eye and perhaps using email to do it. Okay, workshops, and I'm going to get to that. Okay, good question, but you're a couple slides ahead of me. Okay, actually, you were one slide ahead of me. Okay, administrative action versus agency business. Yeah, I was ahead of myself too. Okay, we talked about that. Work sessions, conferences, and retreats. Okay, a work session is a gathering of the elected board where there's no deliberation, no decision making, and communication is usually one way. It's for educational purposes. And I think school districts are a good example where they will have their monthly business meeting, okay, open to the public, et cetera, et cetera. And then they'll have also a monthly work session. Typically, these work sessions are not open to the public, but they can if they want to be. But what happens is you've got the gathering of the elected officials and like the superintendent, the assistant superintendent, the assistant to the assistant superintendent, and so forth. Pardon my sarcasm. But they will make presentations for the benefit of the elected officials to bring them up to speed on ongoing projects, new initiatives, things that they need to be aware of. And the elected officials can ask questions of the presenters, but the elected officials cannot discuss the merits of the presentation among themselves because that would be deliberation. So you can't do that. Okay. Now, every so often, we'll hear about a work session where they have completely adhered to the Sunshine Act. They advertise it, they open it to the public, they allow public comment, and every so often they will take a vote on action. Well, that's a public meeting. It's not a work session. And I would argue that by calling it a work session, you're misrepresenting it to the public because there is the expectation that there would be no decisions made. Now, again, I have no case law to support that. I just think you're playing with fire. If you call it a work session and then end up taking a vote, okay, you're playing fast and loose with the law there, and you could end up getting yourselves into hot water. So be careful about that. But to answer the question and also to explain it further, a work session, there's no expectation of deliberation and there's no expectation of a decision being made, purely for educational purposes. Okay, other questions have come up. Can a board member call the other members individually, all but the chairman, to get a consensus on a topic and then take action on their own? Jeffrey, I would argue no. There was an occurrence that goes back many years that involved the Philadelphia City Council. And they had something that was kind of, I would call shuttle diplomacy. In order to avoid having a quorum of the council meet, they divvied them up into 4 separate groups and put them in 4 separate rooms. And then the chairperson of council went around and had 4 separate discussions. Okay, let's be honest. That was a de facto public meeting or meeting that should have been open to the public. Okay, you had the same discussion with every member of council. It's just that the discussions occurred individually. And that's kind of what you're talking about here with your question. And I would argue that you can't do that because in essence, you're looking for a way to get around the law. And whenever you do that, when you try to outthink the law, you're going to get caught, okay? And you're going to get called out on it. So don't play fast and loose with the law. try to avoid this, okay? Now, I realize sometimes it still happens, okay? And if you have a public meeting where everyone comes in and all the officials vote on an issue without any apparent discussion or deliberation, that sets off a red flag, because that tells me, well, they did discuss it at some point, because they would have had to have known what it is they're voting on. And that discussion did not take place in the public eye. So yeah, I'm going to file a complaint, and they can explain to a judge how this all happened, that they had a vote with no discussion. Okay, and we'll see how that plays out. Sherry, if not open to the public, do there need to be minutes of the administrative meetings? No. Okay, because it's not a public meeting and there's no requirement for minutes of administrative meetings. Administrative meetings do not fall under the Sunshine Act because there's no policy level decisions being made at that point. And again, you need to be careful about what you define as administrative versus what you define as policy, because it can be somewhat subjective. Okay, good questions, folks. Keep them coming. All right, let's talk about, well, first off, man, let me get a sip of coffee. Let's talk about one of the legs of our three-legged stool, public notice. Okay, this is what the law says. 3 days in advance of the first regular meeting of the year, along with all of the remaining meetings, okay? Most codes require that there be what we call an organizational meeting. Usually, it's like the first Tuesday of the year, first Tuesday of the first month of the year, okay? And the advertisement for that meeting has to be at least 3 days in advance. It is a legal notice in a local newspaper, paid newspaper of general circulation. Okay, so legal notice would say there's going to be a meeting of Borough Council, first Tuesday of the month, the time, the place, if it's online, how you join online, and then typically they list the dates of all subsequent meetings for the remainder of the calendar year. Okay? Legal notice in a paid newspaper of general circulation. Well, we recognize that's getting more difficult. But this is what the law says, and until the legislature changes the law, this is what you're going to hear from us. Okay, now, newspaper articles, what they call puff pieces, interviewing the new council members and so forth, that doesn't count. Websites don't count. Now, we think it's good. If you have a website, if you have a Facebook page, yeah, put the information out there about your meetings, okay? But you still need to have that legal notice. And those free sales circulars that fill up our mailbox twice a week, they don't count either because it's a paid newspaper of general circulation, all right? And then you have to have notices posted at the actual meeting site. Am I required to re-advertise a public meeting in a newspaper where the start time has been changed? Yes, okay. If the start time of the meeting changes, even if it's later, you need to re-advertise, okay? Because if someone shows up 30 minutes early and let's say no one's there, they might assume that the meeting has been canceled or whatever, when in fact that's not the case. So you need to advertise, and there would be a good example where I would use your social media to get the word out about delaying the meeting by 30 minutes. Okay? Moving on, public notice. Now, we've been talking about regular meetings, 3 days notice. The Sunshine Act also recognizes special meetings, where now the advance notice goes down to 24 hours. A special meeting is where something has come up that you cannot wait until the next monthly meeting. So you've got to have a special meeting, and you have to go through all the same requirements with the paid newspaper of general circulation. It's just that now you have 24 hours. And it's from the date that it was published, not from when you like contacted the newspaper to let them know you need to run an ad. Okay, and it's becoming more and more difficult with, used to be here in the city of Harrisburg, newspaper was published twice a day. Now I think it's once, I think it's twice a week plus Sundays. And I haven't even checked on that lately, but you need to be aware of the publishing schedule of your local newspaper. And then the Sunshine Act also recognizes emergency meetings where there is no requirement for public notification. It's just that you can't create your own emergency in order to avoid adhering to the Sunshine Act. I use the example of the snowplow. Okay, let's say we're a small borough. We have one snowplow, and it's seen its better days. It's an old piece of equipment, and wouldn't you know it, the forecast says there's a big storm going to hit in 2 days. The snowplow is broken down, and we can no longer get parts for it. We need to buy a new plow. And there happens to be one sitting on the lot a couple miles down the road. Let's have an emergency meeting so we can approve the purchase of this plow. All right? Because of the forecast, because of all the conditions, it's a bona fide emergency. Don't create your own emergency just trying to get around the law, okay? People have tried it and people have gotten caught, okay? Question, if you change a regular board meeting in location in the middle of the year, how far in advance was the meeting? But notice, 3 days, 3 days, Carl. And this happens, sometimes there's a conflict, sometimes work schedules get in the way and you have to change the time or maybe the night that the board is going to meet. So you run a new legal notice with the amended time and dates, okay? And then there is no notification requirement for cancellations. Let's say somebody gets sick, you can't get a quorum, so you need to cancel. There's no requirement for the legal notice, but again, here's a good example where you use your social media. Get the word out on your websites, on your Facebook pages, however you can, maybe even the local cable station, that you're canceling your meeting. That way, I got to tell you, we've fielded those phone calls where someone went down to Borough Hall or the township building and everything was dark, doors were locked, it was crickets. And then they found out the next day, we canceled because so-and-so couldn't make the meeting. All right, nothing upsets people more than stuff like that. So whatever you can do to make, to get the word out, keep your constituents happy, it'll make your life easier, okay? Moving on once again, let's talk about agendas. Now, this is a newer part, I think we're going on 4 or 5 years now since this was added to the Sunshine Act, but newer part of the act that was enacted by the legislature after fielding complaints of elected officials sneaking in big ticket items, if you will, on what otherwise would have been innocuous meetings. So the requirement now is that all agencies for a public meeting must post an agenda of all issues to be discussed or voted on at least 24 hours prior to the holding of that public meeting. This includes regular and any of those special meetings that you might have. Okay, now the questions come up quite often. How detailed does my agenda need to be? I have nothing that I can point to in the Sunshine Act, but there's case law where I'm going to draw a conclusion. And you might think, my conclusion means nothing, which legally it does, or maybe it makes a little bit of sense. But we're going to talk about executive sessions in a little bit here. And there's a case that deals with the executive sessions where it concludes that you have to provide enough detail to adhere or to gain the public's trust. Okay, and I'm paraphrasing the court language. So I'm going to go out on a limb here and say your agenda needs to be detailed enough that a reasonable person can trust the description of what it is you're going to be deliberating or voting on. Okay, you've got to provide enough information so that a reasonable person, a reasonable citizen within your jurisdiction has a good idea as to what it is you've put on the agenda. All right, so it doesn't mean you have to write out several pages and provide a history, but it does mean that, you know, maybe you need to put in a paragraph or two as to what it is you're discussing. Scott, no, and you're ahead of me. I'll get to that. Okay, you've got to, like I said, put enough items in your agenda that folks trust you're going to be and know what it is you're going to be talking about. Now, it needs to be, let me get into this slide a little more. There's no agenda requirement for work sessions because you're not deliberating, you're not voting, right? Conferences or executive sessions. Now, the law also says you need to use websites. If you have a website, then you need to post the agenda on the website. Now, what if we don't have a website, but we have a Facebook page? Well, then it defaults to that media platform. You put your agenda on the Facebook page. Then the agenda also needs to be posted at the agency offices, the meeting site, and you need to have copies of the agenda available at the meeting site itself to give to residents who are attending the meeting. Let's see the questions here. Yeah, Scott, I'll get to yours. Can you in any way do an addition to the agenda at the beginning of the meeting? I'm going to get to that, Jeffrey, with the next slide. So let's go ahead and do that. Changing the agenda. Okay, there has been a change in this, in our interpretation, based on a court case last year, Coleman versus Parkland. And essentially what happened was that day, okay, we're talking about a school district. They had been in negotiations and arrived at a proposed contract for the teachers. That day, the union for the teachers approved the proposed contract. So that night, when the school board met, they said, or the conversation was, well, since the union has agreed to the terms, why don't we go ahead and ratify the contract this evening, even though it had not been on the agenda. Okay, so they followed what was the previous understanding in that they had a vote to amend the agenda and voted then to approve the contract. Okay. Mr. Coleman, who had been a previous board member and was now a state representative, took him to court. And the court said, no, you can't do that. The way we read the language of this provision of the Sunshine Act is that you can only change for de minimis reasons. You cannot change to approve any contracts or any expenditure for that matter. So you can do an addition to the agenda. The law uses that term addition or add, okay? But only for de minimis reasons where there is no entering into a contract or expending funds. Okay, those are the only conditions in which you can amend the agenda. Otherwise, it has to be on the agenda at least 24 hours in advance. So what's the timeline here? Well, anything prior to the 24-hour window, you can change the agenda as you see fit. Once you enter into the 24-hour window, prior to calling the meeting to order, there can be no change to the agenda unless it's de minimis. No expenditure of funds, no entering into a contract. Once the meeting has been called to order, okay, you can change the agenda, but again, only for de minimis reasons. And if you decide to change the agenda during the meeting, it has to be announced that you're changing it, and you have to give the reason why. And then the elected officials need to vote to change the agenda. And then, only if deemed necessary, they would need to vote on whatever the issue is that they're proposing to deliberate on. Adding an item to the agenda does not always lead to a vote. Okay, they may decide not to vote, and that's okay. But the potential is here then that two things are reflected in the minutes, which is the official record of the meeting that takes place. Number one, you had a vote take place to amend the agenda. That's reflected in the minutes. And then there would be deliberation and the potential to vote on whatever was added to the agenda, which again would also be reflected in the official record of the meeting. Okay, so the minutes must reflect that change. Now, if the agenda is amended, it must again be posted within 24 hours of the conclusion of the meeting. Okay, and you would post it at all the places that you posted the original agenda within 24 hours. Okay, so the question has come up, well, how long do we need to post the agenda that we amended? My answer is, I don't know. It's not in the law. But here's George's logic, and George might be full of it. And I would be wary of standing up in front of a judge and saying, well, this is what George says, but this is what I would do. You've got the 24-hour window prior to the meeting. You've got the 24-hour window after the meeting. So how long would I keep the amended agenda posted? Yeah, 24 hours. A judge might disagree with me someday, but for the time being, that's what I would do. You do whatever you feel is appropriate. If you still got questions, I'd have that discussion with your solicitor and see, what they think. But, the question comes up, so that's the best answer I can give you. Again, it is not legal advice. Don't misinterpret what I'm saying here. All righty. Moving ahead, public comment. Always a fun time. Okay, the public, under the Sunshine Act, has the right to comment on all matters that are or may be before the board. And commenters can be limited to residents and taxpayers of the jurisdiction. Occasionally, someone will come in from a neighboring township, neighboring borough. They want to participate in public comment. The board can say, no, we're not going to allow that because this is what the Sunshine Act says. Then there is the right to comment on all issues that are or may be before the board before any pertinent vote. Okay, that term may is somewhat problematic because it basically opens up the comment period to anything people want to talk about. If Fred wants to complain about the potholes on his street, he can do that under the Sunshine Act. But a board can establish reasonable rules for public comment. Typically, they're time limits. Everyone gets 3 minutes tonight. Or let's say you've got some big issue coming up and a group comes in, they're all wearing the same t-shirts and they all sign up for public comment. Well, there's nothing preventing the board chair from approaching that group and saying, hey, I think we're probably going to get a lot of repetition here. We'll be here all night. Would you guys mind appointing a spokesperson? And we'll give them 10 minutes to make sure that all your points get discussed, that you can do this. Or there is a practice that we see gaining traction
of specific comment periods versus general comment periods. What it is, and when an item comes up on the agenda, okay, and then you have public comment, your public comment is limited to what the agenda item is. But then at the end of the night, we open it up for general comments, where you have the free-for-all, where people can complain about the potholes and so forth. Okay, that seems to be working. There's nothing in the law that says you must do this. We're simply putting it out there as a best practice that a lot of jurisdictions are now doing. It seems to work for them. Maybe you want to talk about it, maybe you don't, but it's out there as one of the reasonable rules that you can have in governing public comment. Okay? Executive sessions. Okay. Scott, this is where you need to pay attention. And I'm sure you are. But an executive session is a gathering of the board where you're discussing a sensitive issue outside of the public eye. Okay? It can be held before a public meeting, during a public meeting, right after the public meeting, or at some future time that you would announce that you're going to have an executive session. When you do this, Scott, you must provide the complete reason for why you had or will be having the executive session. And this is supported by case law, where the case is Reading versus the Reading Eagle. It's the Reading City Council versus the local newspaper for Berks County. And what was happening is the chairperson of the city council would announce, we're going into executive session for a personnel matter. Well, the Reading Eagle didn't feel that was enough. And they wanted the city council to explain why, they were going into executive session with more information. So they took Reading City Council to court. It made it all the way up to the Pennsylvania Commonwealth Court, where they issued a ruling that basically said, and I'm paraphrasing here, you need to provide enough information so that the public trusts you're going into a secret meeting for the right reasons, okay? Again, a little subjective, but the court was fairly clear on this. So for instance, rather than saying personnel reasons, you would say, we have a personnel matter involving an alleged work rule infraction by one of our employees that could result in a suspension. Okay, you're not naming names, but you're giving enough of a reason so that the member of the public can conclude, okay, that's a good reason. Or maybe you're going into executive session for litigation to discuss a court case. So you would explain, XYZ Corporation is suing us over a zoning decision that we made. Here is the docket number in the local common pleas court, and we need to discuss, or our solicitor wants to brief us on a possible settlement, something like that. So you're providing enough of a reason so that a reasonable person can conclude you're going into executive session for the right reasons, because otherwise it's a secret meeting. So you want to maintain the public's trust. All righty. In executive session, there's no requirement for minutes, but if you do keep minutes, they are exempt from public disclosure under Pennsylvania's right to know law. And you cannot take official action during an executive session. You can poll the members to see what it is how are you leaning on this? Should we suspend the guy? But if you decide to suspend or decide on an official course of action, you must conclude the executive session, reconvene the public meeting, and then take a vote in front of the public eye. Because then, again, it becomes memorialized in the official record of the meeting. If you forget to vote, it's not an official action, is it? Okay. All right, questions have popped up. Let me make sure I'm not missing something. I think the first one is, can we stop a resident from interrupting a meeting and tell them to wait until general comments? If that's the context, during public comment that they go off script, yes, but you need to be very careful about that. 2 years ago, there was a hot button topic in a school district. The assistant solicitor who was present shut down the person because he said your comments are irrelevant. But then they didn't allow them to comment later in any way. And a group filed a federal lawsuit claiming they were abridging their right to free speech. The court agreed, and there was an out-of-court settlement, and I think they got everything back on track. But again, you want to be very careful and make sure that that resident does get a chance to comment just later on. Okay. If you want to establish reasonable rules for commenting, does it need to be a resolution or voted on at all? Typically, you would vote on it as part of your rules for meetings. However, like if you've decided to follow Robert's Rules of Order, there's a provision in Robert's Rules where you can vote to set the rules aside. So you set the rules aside and then allow a certain degree of flexibility with public comment. That's how I would look at that. Butler versus Cindy Lane Borough expands on it, some more potential lawsuits. Okay, thank you. Who can call an executive meeting? And can it be any day or time or just on meeting days? It can be any day or time. It just needs to be announced either ahead of time or after the fact so that the public is aware that the executive session took place. And typically, only the chair can call the executive session. But, it varies on the dynamics as to how your public body operates. Typically, it's the chair that calls any gathering that would be considered an executive session. Okay, part 2 of executive session. Let's get into this. The reasons. Well, personnel matters. Hiring, firing, discipline. Okay, now, the personnel matter must involve either a specific employee or a specific position. It cannot involve personnel policy. Like if you're dealing with leave policy that will apply to all employees, you do that in a public setting. Only when it involves one employee or one vacancy, one position, can you discuss it in an executive session. Discussing labor negotiations. Yeah, you wouldn't do that in public. Considering the purchasing, leasing, or selling of property. You can do that in executive session. Consulting with counsel about litigation, legal strategy, potential settlements, etc. You do that in private. Avoiding violating privilege or confidentiality, where your solicitor wants to provide legal advice. They may ask for an executive session real quick, okay, because they're worried that counsel is going to discuss or violate confidentiality by discussing it in public. So they quick call an executive session to warn them about, a judge has ruled we can't discuss this in public. Okay, just so you're aware of that. Now we go back out of the executive session, okay? You haven't violated privilege. Or discussing university admission standards. I don't know, this was written in the 1950s and I wasn't around. Or discussing emergency preparedness, homeland security stuff, evacuation routes within the borough or township or whatever. That kind of stuff you can discuss in private because of concerns for emergency preparedness. If a police officer is hired by the police department, does the borough council need to make a decision at a public meeting? It depends. I can't give you a definitive answer, Ellen, because depending on the jurisdiction, they operate differently. You've got some small municipalities where the council wants to be in on the decision making. You've got other where you've got a strong mayor type of government where the mayor makes the decision on hiring and firing. You've got other types of jurisdictions where, given the size of operations, it's up to the police chief. They decide who gets hired, who gets fired. Okay, it just depends on the makeup of the jurisdiction, what might be in the particular code, and also how the elected board has deferred to the management staff of that jurisdiction. I can't give you a definitive answer. Can council members talk about what was said in an executive session? Yes, they can, but the other council members can sanction them in one way or another if there's been a violation of the confidentiality. Yeah, and this happens. You know, sometimes you'll have like a minority member, when I say a political party minority, who will go rogue and talk about what was discussed in executive session. The other council people can decide, you know, how to deal with it. There's nothing in the Sunshine Act that you could apply to that particular situation. Okay, but it happens. Okay, so yeah, we're aware of it. All right, moving on, another sip of coffee. We're getting close to the end of the presentation, so I want to talk about what happens when there's a violation of the Sunshine Act. Okay, well, first offhand, we talked about the public standing up and, you know, can we shut them down? Yes and no, okay, but mostly no. At any time during a meeting, if a member of the public believes there's a violation of the Sunshine Act taking place, they can stand up and respectfully bring it to the attention of the board. They can say, I believe that you're making a decision here without allowing for public comment prior to that decision. That would be a violation of the Sunshine Act. All right, so let's say the board agrees. Oh, and by the way, they're not out of order by doing that. Okay, the law, it's in the law. It allows them to do that. Let's say the board agrees. It's like, you know what? You're right. We got caught up in all the discussion, everything that was going on. We forgot about the public comment. Okay, we're not going to vote now. We're going to have public comment first, and then we'll vote. Or if they did vote, they could say, okay, we're going to rescind the vote. We're going to do it over. We're going to allow public comment, and then we'll vote once we hear what everyone has to say. Okay, agencies can cure their violations. No harm, no foul. Now, what if they disagree with the citizen and they go ahead and they had the vote and everything proceeded? Well, the citizen, their recourse, because there's no enforcement agency for the Sunshine Act, their recourse is within 30 days of the perceived violation. They can seek legal relief in the appropriate court. For local agencies like boroughs and townships, school districts, it would be in your county court of common pleas. For state agencies, it would be in the Pennsylvania Commonwealth Court. Or if you think that there's some sort of criminal culpability, you could approach your county district attorney. But you would, seek legal relief. Okay, maybe you want the vote taken over. Maybe you want the votes to be voided. The thing is, judges have great flexibility in how they would apply any sanction under the Sunshine Act. Okay, they can void the meeting, they can void the vote, they can simply slap a wrist and say, don't do that again. Or they could go so far as to levy a financial fine. It's $1,000 for the first violation, $2,000 for the second violation. It's paid by the public official, not the agency. Okay. So if you're attempting to avoid the Sunshine Act and you get caught, and let's say you have to stand in front of that judge and pass or attempt to pass the straight face test, and the judge disagrees, it could get really expensive. And I don't know what your experience is with county judges, but from my point of view, you catch them on a bad day, there's two things that you need to look out to make sure you don't hear. The first one is when the judge says, "I'm not sure I understand," and then they make it clear that they do understand. And then the second one is, "And I never want to see you in my courtroom again." Okay. Usually that involves pulling out your checkbook on the way out the door because they have fined you. Now, in recent years, it's been kind of interesting. Judges are ruling that there has been a violation, but then they're requiring that the public officials get Sunshine Act training. And usually they send them our way. And we've done that. We provided training as the result of a court settlement. And then we provide a letter to the judge saying that, the mayor and the council people, whatever, have successfully participated in Sunshine Act training. It's been interesting, and we're seeing that more and more. It's developing a trend. But, that's what's involved if you happen to violate the Sunshine Act. Okay, coming up on the end here, some miscellaneous stuff, okay? For a public meeting, you have to have minutes, okay? Because that's the official record of what took place. It has to have who was in attendance, and if there was a roll call vote, it has to record how each public official voted, yea or nay. The public can record public meetings, and they don't have to tell anybody. It's not a violation of the wiretap law. It's not a violation of the Sunshine Act. They can do that. For instance, I can set my cell phone on record, put it in my pocket, walk in, and I don't have to tell a soul. What I recommend is that the chairperson notify during the initial welcome that there's no expectation of privacy. This is a public meeting and it can be recorded by anybody. If by chance the agency is recording the meeting, and usually they do for keeping the minutes, that recording is a public record and it's accessible under the right to know law. Questions popped up. Should a board hold a roll call vote? That's up to the board, and I think sometimes it's dictated by your rules of order. There's nothing in the Sunshine Law that requires a roll call vote. Only that if you do have a roll call vote, you have to record how each member voted. If our secretary records with a voice recorder in order to do the minutes, does the record need to be kept or can it be deleted once the minutes are finished? You can delete the recording once there's no longer an administrative need for it, but until it's deleted, it's subject to access under the right to know law. It's considered a public record. Can agencies establish rules for members of the public or the board members recording the meeting? Reasonable rules, yes. Okay, they can still, as long as those rules adhere to the spirit of that provision. For instance, if someone stops the meeting and says, "Wait a minute, I need to flip the tape in my recorder," or, "Hey, I need to change the batteries. Can you guys wait a second?" Yeah, you can pass a reasonable rule saying you don't do that. Okay, but as far as requiring them to tell you that they're recording or that they can only, well, for instance, here's a reasonable rule. Television station comes in. They need to set up in the back so that they're not blocking anyone's views, and they can't use any bright lights that would otherwise blind the board. Okay, that's a reasonable rule. So yes, you can do that, and it doesn't violate the spirit of that provision. Do you have to provide meeting minutes to the public before the next meeting when you officially approve the minutes, not before. No, if you look, you're actually, Carl, asking a right to know question, but I don't mind answering it since, this is that area where the two laws intersect. The way the right to know law reads is that you need to, the code for your particular jurisdiction requires minutes, okay? Until the next regularly scheduled meeting of the board, when they approve those minutes, until that happens, the minutes are considered draft. So they can be withheld from public disclosure. Once the board votes to, once the board meets, whether they approve the minutes or not, once the board meets, the minutes become a public record and have to be disclosed under the right to know law. Okay, the minutes do not have to be approved. The board simply has to meet. I think the operative word there is the date of the meeting, something like that. Take a look at that provision in the right to know law. It's one of the exemptions. Okay, and that's when they become public. And it looks like Walt is, giving you that exemption there. Okay, what can the board do to enforce the recording rules, especially if the member of the person recording refuses to comply? Well, I'm not sure what you mean. If they're interrupting the meeting because of the recording, then they're out of order. But there's no rule that says they even need to tell you that they're recording. So I'm not sure, Don, I understand the context of your question. But there is no rule that they have to adhere to. But if they do somehow interrupt the meeting, then they're out of order, and you would deal with that as you would anyone else who's out of order. Oh, okay. You're looking at the blog post, which, by the way, folks, is a great resource. We have a blog on WordPress that you can link to off of our website, where appeals officers are going into great detail on some of these exemptions. And it's really good stuff, especially if you're a solicitor and you want to understand how we rule on and how the courts have ruled on exemptions. Check out the blog in this latest series that we've been putting up. Okay, not sure if you can answer this. I don't know either. If an employee records the meeting for their own purposes, will this fall under public or agency recordings and therefore subject to right to know? Well, no. The recording must be in the possession of the agency for it to be a public record. If I, as a private citizen, record the meeting, then it's not a public record. It's my personal property. Now, if you are a public official and you're recording the meeting, then you are an officer of that agency, and the recording is considered a public record. Don't try to say, well, I just recorded it for my own use, not as an officer of the agency. That doesn't work. If a person refuses to record in the designated area established, what can be done? Okay, Don, I understand it now. Well, they're out of order. You've passed a reasonable rule. And again, this falls outside the Sunshine Act. But whatever you would do when someone is, not following your rules, you might have them ejected if need be. I would take a look at, what's the result of them not adhering to the reasonable rule? Are they in fact creating a disturbance? If they're not, then that straight face test comes into play. But if they truly are being disruptive, then you would eject them or have them removed like anyone else. Okay, could also be considered a working paper of the council member. Potentially. Okay, I understand now, Walt. You're talking about the recording. Yeah, if a council member is recording the meeting, okay, they are an agent of the of the township or the borough or whatever. And as such, that recording, which is in their possession, is not private. It is public. And the courts have ruled on that. So it would be subject to disclosure under the right to know law. Okay. All right. We are at the end of the presentation. So if you have any more questions, boy, you've had them. Now's a good time to get them in. Yeah, here we go. Any guidance on where the public can find someone to provide guidance and fill out the complaint at the Court of Common Pleas? Ellen, the best advice I can give you is you're going to have to approach an attorney. Okay. There is so little case law available in court activity on the Sunshine Act that there's not a lot of experts out there. But what I would recommend is, try Google. There are some attorneys who, we can't recommend them here because that would obviously be a conflict of interest. But there are attorneys out there who, that is their area of expertise, government transparency. And there are some who, if we were private citizens, I would recommend. They can help you out. There are also very good local attorneys who, even though they may not be experts now, they would educate themselves. Every county is a little different in how it operates and the dynamics. So that's what I would, that's where I would go. Okay, this is the worst part of the Sunshine Act. Yeah, I agree. Let me just say, I think it's somewhat, it's good in that it gives the power to the public, but it's also bad because of the expense involved. And, if by chance there would be an agency assigned as the enforcement agency, they would have a very tough job. Okay, because you're talking courts, things are very subjective as to what's a violation and what's not. I think there's an upside and a downside to it, and it's not going to be an easy problem to solve. But maybe there should be some sort of enforcement agency, but that's way above my pay grade. Can you accept public comment via email, phone prior to the meeting after the agenda is posted? Yes, you can, but again, that's outside of the public, that's outside of the Sunshine Act. We saw a lot of that during the pandemic, where it was the only way you could comment. But at the end of the day, the public has a right to stand in front of their public officials physically and comment. The legislature has made that clear. Okay. Okay. I think we've all covered it. Just to close out, I want to recommend you take a look at our website. It is the best government website you will ever see. Updated 6 days a week, new information, new court decisions, information on training, guides for you to use for the Right to Know law and the Sunshine Act, FAQs, et cetera, okay? Feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. We really run long today, but that's okay. I appreciate all the questions. Tells me you folks are into it, okay? You want to see this law work. Will this meeting recording be published? Don, yes, it is. I had that in my opening remarks. If you want a copy of it, contact our office. I think what happens is they provide you with a link that gets you into the recording. Do it in a couple days because this needs to be cleaned up and trimmed and so forth, and then they do whatever magic they have to do. But in a couple days, reach out to our office, tell them you want a copy of the recording, and they can fix you right up. Okay, folks, thank you for your time. Hey, stay dry out there. We're getting some rain, which we really need, and I hope you are too. All right, signing off, if I find the right button, and have a great day.